Welcome to the New Monastics Podcast, where we'll be discussing all aspects of the contemplative life and interspirituality in the context of modernity. On each episode, we will choose a topic to explore with one of today's leading teachers or thinkers. The New Monastics Podcast is a project of Charis Foundation for New Monasticism and Interspirituality, which is dedicated to the emergence of a newly conceived contemplative life of embodied spirituality and sacred activism. Welcome to the New Monastics Podcast. I'm Nathaniel, co-founder of Charis Foundation for New Monasticism and Interspirituality, and one of your hosts.
And I'm Daniel, your other host for the show.
Today we'll be resurrecting a classic. In the 1970s, long before podcasts like our own, there were radio shows whose reach was more limited, but whose impact was still powerful. Among the best of those shows was In the Spirit on WBAI in New York City, on which Lex Hixon interviewed some of the best, most interesting spiritual teachers and thinkers of the 1970s. Alan Watts, Tarthang Tulku, Rabbi Zalman Schachter, Ram Dass. But what made the show really special was Hixon himself, a deep spiritual thinker and practitioner who would soon make his own mark, and whose insight and sincere questions made the show far more interesting. In 2016, my friend and fellow publisher Paul Cohen of Monkfish published these interviews in a book edited by Sheila Hixon called Conversations in the Spirit, Lex Hixon's In the Spirit Interviews, a Chronicle of the 70s Spiritual Revolution. Today we'll be using the book with permission from Monkfish to look at some of these interviews in the context of where we are today.
The first interview we want to look at is from October 8th, 1978, with Sufi master Pir Vilayat Inayat Khan, 1916 to 2004, the son of Hazrat Inayat Khan, the first Sufi master in the West, and the founder of Inayati, or Universalist Sufism.
This interview, unlike many others, was recorded on location at the Abode of the Message, Pir Vilayat's spiritual community in New Lebanon, New York. So, I think we want to begin with what Lex Hixon does in the interview itself. He starts with a kind of introduction, a little bit of an apology too, because this is a tape-recorded interview. So he's actually bringing a tape and playing this on the radio. And this is because he went out and recorded Pir Vilayat, as we said, at the Abode of the Message in New Lebanon, New York, which is an old Sheikh community, which the Sufis came and took over in 1974, 1975. And what's interesting, and what Lex Hixon writes in the introduction, or talks about in the introduction, is that he himself is just coming back from Istanbul, from a visit to Turkey, where he's been spending a great deal of time with Jarahi Sufis. And the visit is so impactful on him that it's making him ask deep questions, deep personal questions about his own path, and whether he should be on a fully Sufi Islamic spiritual path, or whether he's really this kind of interspiritual personality, who loves Ramakrishna and, loves all these traditions. How does he locate himself, is, I think, the question he's asking. So coming back with all these questions and maybe even some level of personal, I think it's too much to say crisis, but serious questioning, he comes to see Pir Vilayat Inayat Khan, the son of Hazrat Inayat Khan, the founder of Universalist Sufism. So a Sufism that is not necessarily bound to Islam. Perhaps hoping, and he says this somewhat explicitly, that Pir Vilayat will help to advise or guide him on how to approach his own hybridity and find some grounding. And what comes out is a really interesting interview where they really kind of go back and forth exploring this question in a way that I think maybe even Lex Hickson found surprising. Partially because I think he believed that Pir Vilayat was maybe holding Islam a little more closely. I don't know, what do you think?
What do you mean by holding Islam a little bit more closely?
I think he says in the introduction, he introduces Pir Vilayat in a way that I think he believes is accurate, meaning that because Hazrat Inayat Khan was a Sufi Muslim from India, that Pir Vilayat was raised in an Islamic environment in the home, and I don't know that that's true.
Right. Lex Hickson is coming with the assumption that although Pir Vilayat is now the head of this Universalist Sufi order, many of whose members are not Muslim, he himself has received a traditional Muslim education and training in the mystical sides of Islam, which I think we're a little bit unsure of how true exactly that is. But I also wanted just to add, in terms of the setup for the interview, is embroiled in Lex Hickson's personal question is also a larger philosophical question in terms of the validity of interspirituality, of pursuing engagement with multiple traditions versus being committed to one path or one tradition and digging one deep well, so to speak. And it seems pretty clear, I think Lex Hickson says it explicitly, that he had basically been holding this bias that was very common in this time period amongst kind of progressive spiritual folks, is that, a lot of traditional religion is very narrow. I don't think I could personally feel bound to one tradition or one truth because I see this kind of overarching mystical truth that pervades all the traditions. So that's what's really in alignment. And his experience with the Jarahi Sufis is really shaking that foundation of his own spiritual path. It's like he's been searching from that bias and has had clearly a lot of rich experience and growth through that lens. And now he's questioning, maybe to progress further, I need to commit to one specific thing. And it does seem that he feels this particular resonance and attraction to Islamic Sufism as practiced by the Jarahi Sufis he's encountered.
Mm-hmm. And I think you're right. You name it as an assumption. And the assumption does seem to have been, to some degree, that, yes, you're either in that tradition and practicing it, and they uses this word, in its purity, or you have this universalist assumption, which means almost that, you can't practice in those traditions because, your belief system excludes it. Because you are universalist, you can't be practicing in the traditions. It's a kind of dualism, of the universalist. And I don't think that we would necessarily talk that way anymore because there's so much evidence of people practicing within traditions now and still maintaining a universalist view.
But I think it is fair that there are certain elements of a tradition and certain beliefs that are commonly held within a tradition that somebody with a more universalist perspective would not be able to wholeheartedly believe or access. And that's not to say that the technologies of the traditions and a lot of the teachings and practices wouldn't be able to be effectively used, but I think, or used is, I don't like that language, but effectively engaged with or utilized.
No, I think that that's true. On the other hand, that may be true even if you don't have a universalist notion. There may be elements of the tradition as a whole with which you're uncomfortable and have some level of judgment about or personal perspective on. But clearly, if you have a universalist viewpoint, then aspects of exclusivism within the tradition you can't hold to.
But this feels connected even to just other challenges that modernity and modern science is offering our traditions in terms of challenges to traditional or religious worldviews. I'm being reminded of the Dalai Lama conceding that maybe at this point it's not right to believe that Mount Meru is the center of the world, because from a science perspective, we know that that's not true. And the Dalai Lama says that's not the hill we're trying to die on. It doesn't really matter. And at this point, yeah, maybe it's right. We change our cosmology to reflect and integrate these views of modern science. So it's similar to that, it feels like.
Yeah, yeah. Coming back to where we started with Hickson coming back from Istanbul, having had this deep experience of feeling, a powerful resonance, not only with the Jarahi Sufism that was practiced there, but also feeling himself alive in it and feeling great resonance with it itself, like he found himself a Sufi and found himself able to practice at a level of depth there that maybe, I don't know if this is true, he doesn't really talk about this, that he hadn't reached elsewhere. And then he comes back in the interview to saying, but leaving that environment, he experienced a disjunct again. So while in the environment was one thing, and then coming out of the environment, he felt a little bit different. So I think it's worth reading a little bit what he says here.
The impression that I received there was that the mystical life of Islam that we all feel so drawn to and that we think of as Sufism is not really easily separable from the life of Orthodox Islam. And I was overwhelmed by this feeling, and I began practicing the orthodoxy. And in the environment there, it felt very good and very inspiring. But at a certain point, I realized that as a contemporary American, I couldn't really, at this point, really fully embrace Orthodox Islam. I felt that my sympathies go to a broader scope of all the world religions. And so one of the first things I wanted to do coming back to this country was somehow come to you.
And then he goes on to speak to what we were just talking about, because your father was a Chishti Sufi Muslim practicing in the household 5 times a day prayer. That's not so clear that's true within the household or what Pir Vilayat grew up with, but it's pretty clear what Lex Hickson is wanting to deal with.
And just to be clear, we find this conversation not only interesting in and of itself, but that it points to a lot of tensions and questions that we're dealing with today. And so feel like it's worth revisiting, as this kind of conversation did happen between what we now kind of recognize as two giants of spirituality of a certain time period. Both Lex Hickson and Pir Vilayat were really pioneering forces and voices in this space.
Yeah. And 2 Sufi masters, because while that is not yet true at the time of the interview, it will be true over the years. And maybe that needs, a little backtracking to say the interview prior to Pir Vilayat's interview was with Sheikh Muzaffer Ozak, who is the head of the Jarahi lineage of Sufism, and who in 1978 was visiting the United States on a very important, very significant trip for Sufism in America, when the head of the lineage from Turkey comes to the United States. Hazrat Inayat Khan was maybe the first Sufi master to come over, but later, much later, there were a few others that started to come over that had powerful impact. Sheikh Suleiman Loras of the Mevlevi tradition, and Sheikh Muzaffer Ozak of the Jarahi lineage. And so Sheikh Muzaffer was on Lex Hickson's In the Spirit show, the interview before, March 12th, 1978. This one is taking place October 8th, 1978. So in March of this year, he met Sheikh Muzaffer, and I'd have to go back and check the facts on this, But in my memory, Sheikh Muzaffer was on the show and being interviewed and answered the questions through a translator. The translator might have been Sheikh Tosin Barak, who also becomes a successor. But I believe Sheikh Muzaffer may not have left the room before he gave some indication that you are to be a Sufi or, you belong in this lineage one way or another. And it's not long after that Lex Hickson is being drawn in. And in the years to come, he will become a successor of Sheikh Muzaffer and a lineage head of a new branch of the lineage in the United States, which takes on a little bit more of a universalist character. It still maintains a relationship to Islam, but Lex Hickson will become the head of that, and he'll become Sheikh Nur al-Jarahi. And Nur, light, reflecting his given name, Lex, which is also light, lux in Latin. And so here we have two Sufi masters, but one is not yet named as such. And they're both heads of lineages that will have a universalist aspect at the very least. So that's kind of in the mix here.
Yeah, and so we're meeting Lex Hickson at a particular point in his journey, basically right after this direct encounter with Muzaffer Osak and then the trip to Turkey, which allowed him an opportunity to sink in. And I'm wondering if now is a good time to present the listeners with a little bit of zikr, as a practice of repetition of wazifas, very similar to mantras, and mostly in Arabic. Sometimes other languages are used, but in the actual interview and in the spirit, he was playing a recording of some of the zikr sessions that he encountered in Turkey. And I think it provides a lot of sense of the richness and cultivated space that he encountered there. And so maybe if we can just take a second to play a clip of that so you can experience that vibration that he was immersed in.
So I think you can hear for yourself just like how awesome that is with presence and depth. And I don't think it was a purely aesthetic choice on Lex Hickson's part to include that. I think in some ways he's trying to contextualize the interview by bringing that in, by saying, you feel it too, right? You feel the depth and the richness of that. That's what's affected me. So I think him playing that is actually a pretty important part of the interview itself. It helps us know where he's coming from.
And then again, to your point of his experience of the external forms of Islam not being easily separable from this mystical depth that one can maybe hear coming through the zikr practice. And so the way I would maybe put his question for myself is in slightly a facetious way, but to make the point would be, how do I get the jewel at the center without wearing the costume? Or do I need to wear an outfit to get to the center? And I think, again, his presumption was that, no, you don't need that. And now he's saying,
Maybe I do.
Maybe I do. Maybe it's not that simple. Maybe the outer forms cultivate something internally and vice versa.
I think so. I think perhaps that was an assumption before, and maybe this is the reason for the struggle. Now it seems those things are so bound. And I don't think it's necessarily easier for us to discern that either. Like, where are the lines? And maybe there aren't so much lines. It is a question. Can you extract an essence, and we might call that essentialism, and there are problems with that perspective of essentialism.
Mm-hmm.
Or everything exists in a context, but can it only exist in that context? Or possibly third, and this is a lot more what we might be talking about today, can we enter into an authentic context and come out of it with, let's say, a vibe or a vibration that is authentic and transplants itself in a new atmosphere? And that's what they come to next. So Pir Vilayat has this to say in response to that. Wasn't so much a question, but Lex Hickson saying, boy, I felt it when I was there. That felt completely authentic. And while I felt natural being Muslim in that environment, maybe I didn't feel like I could maintain that out of that environment. He doesn't say that exactly, but that's kind of how Pir Vilayat responds to the question. So Pir Vilayat says this.
I think you hit the nail on the head when you said that you found it very comfortable to adopt the formal adherence to the ritual of Islam when you were living in that environment, so that you were in harmony with the environment. When you came back to the United States, however, when you looked upon it in retrospect, you felt that you couldn't very well continue the same practices in this environment. That's very, very typical, because I feel that the religions have developed in the course of the growth of civilizations very much like the plants developed in the course of evolution, or different species of animals. They have their part to play in the whole, and in a particular climate, in a particular environment, a certain plant grows naturally, and if you try to acclimatize it somewhere else, you run into difficulties.
But then, of course, Lex Hickson astutely points out, but Pir Vilayat, you can transplant plants to a new environment. So what about that?
But Pir Vilayat, excuse me for interrupting. The fact is that you can and do transplant plants from one country to another, and they grow essentially in the same way. And for instance, your father and your background was that of an orthodox Islam that had moved all the way from Mecca to India, but still retained such practices as the 5 times a day prayer.
Right. And what's interesting about that is, just the very example that Pir Vilayat is using, he's quoting his father, Hazrat Inayat Khan. And so in the sayings of his father, and many of those are represented in the text that Inayati Sufis use, and full disclosure, both Daniel and I can say that we're both Inayati Sufis. And one of the texts that we use for kind of daily meditations is called the bowl of sake, which means the bowl that is borne by the wine bearer, the person who brings the wine. And the wine is Sufism or mysticism here. So the bowl of sake is kind of a book of days that we use for daily meditations. And the August 2nd entry, so this one is one I know very well because that's my birthday, so I'm always coming upon this one every year. But Hazrat Inayat Khan says, the same herb planted in different atmospheric conditions will vary in form accordingly, but will retain its characteristics, its basic characteristics.
Sorry, just to interject, that's where Pir Vilayat goes on to kind of correct himself when Lex Hickson challenges him on this point of you can transplant plants, and he says,
Yes, I think one can be more specific. One can indeed transplant plants, but now, of course, scientists are finding out that when one does, they do undergo some kind of mutation in order to adapt themselves.
Exactly. And so comes off a little bit like an argument, like Lex Hickson challenges him. And Hickson apologizes for this in the introduction. He says, I don't want you to think this is an argument because I'm challenging. I have so much respect and I really came seeking guidance. But this was really it really just shows that he's in the questioning and really wants to find the answers.
He also notes that the conversation isn't just intellectual in terms of the feeling of it, that it felt very much like him and Pir Vilayat were sharing a very deep and profound and rich space, and that something beyond or below the words was very much happening in their dialogue. And he describes leaving the abode where he was interviewing Pir Vilayat and him and his wife who edited this book feeling immense joy upon leaving. And so it feels like even beyond the intellectual conversation, there was this deep question for Lex Hickson that seemed like in some roundabout way maybe was resolved on at least on some level internally, like some clarity, some lightness. So we want to just point that out because a lot of the times, even in a conversation like this, we're using words to try to point to something that is beyond or below the words.
Right. It can come off, like they're challenging back and forth, but it's important in understanding in the way Lex Hickson represented that back. It wasn't that Pir Vilayat believes, you can't transplant things. He clearly does, because he's so much a student of his father. He's holding the transmission of his father. And so, Pir Vilayat knows this saying very well. The same herb planted in different atmospheric conditions will vary in form accordingly, but will retain its characteristics. So if he seemed to be saying otherwise, he's clearly not. This is what he does believe. But as you just pointed out, that doesn't mean that there aren't challenges to when it's transplanted. Different conditions sometimes mean there's a challenge to the growth and sometimes a stimulus for a new kind of growth. It will retain a lot of basic characteristics, but it might require a mutation. And I think Sufism has always been an excellent example of this, because there is something essential about Sufism as expressed all over the world. It's a mistake when people say to Sufis, like, you're not a true Sufi if you don't speak Arabic or something. Well, that's not even true of Islam. Many Muslims all over the world don't speak Arabic as their native language. They have to use it for their prayers, of course, but their common tongue might be the common tongue of their land. And so this is true of Sufism too. There are Turkish Sufis, there are Iranian, Persian Sufis, Sufis in Africa, and there is something essential between us, that we recognize one another, and yet there are cultural changes. Like we all say zikr, but if you've heard some of the zikr from some of the African orders, like the Muradiyya, or even Qadris in Africa, it's very African, beautifully African, and the musical forms in India are very Indian. And so there's a truth here, and there's a mutation and something essential. And so Sufism is itself already a good example of this.
And maybe this is a good place just to point out that is maybe problematic in the first place to talk about quote unquote pure religions. Because when we really look, there aren't really pure religions. every major religion we know of is some form of syncretism with previous traditions, and then this dynamic that you're speaking to with Sufism can be observed the world over in many different traditions.
Yeah, and that's something that is perhaps, reading today, this interview from 1978, that discussion is one of the hardest parts for me to swallow in terms of the way they're talking. The idea that there is a pure form of the religion. Well, even if he's hanging out with Jarahi Sufis in Istanbul and they're all good Muslims, what school of legal practice do they follow? Are they Hanafi or another school of legal practice? And so, what is pure Islam? Who's practicing it purely? Who's doing it right? Well, there's always somebody to say, we're doing it right. And that always excludes somebody else. So that idea is, like, I think if thought about for a few minutes, you wouldn't so much be talking that way. But a lot of their disagreement, and they do say they come to a disagreement at some point, seems to hinge on the idea of pure traditions and then those traditions fading away. And I think we get something of an extreme presentation, like the disagreement is based a little bit on the idea that there is something pure and that pure tradition is bound to end. And so it's a funny place that we come to in the interview itself.
So Lex Hickson asks,
Do you think this should be kept up? And do you think that there should be people who do keep the independent traditions of Christianity and Judaism and Islam? Or do you think gradually those things will fall away and what will happen?
Oh, they're bound to fall away, but
Are they?
Not for me to.
Are they?
Much as, for example, the different costumes, clothes that people wear.
But a religious belief and whole spiritual so-called forms are deeper than costumes. I mean, they're very.
Of course, they're much deeper, but I think they will definitely. There will be more and more emerging. I think that's absolutely certain. It may take a long time.
And this is where Lex kind of draws a line in the sand, and he says,
I would say that there is a clear point of disagreement between us, because I would look to the fact of these independent traditions existing also in their purity, kept up by people who have that form of destiny.
Yes, I think that's very beautiful. If to the extent that it is done, of course, and can be done, I think it's very beautiful. I think and the same thing applies to clothes. I like very much. An Indian to wear, woman to wear sari and so on. Yes.
Clothes are
maybe it's just an example.
But I mean, we're talking on a very, very terribly serious level of a person's spiritual worldview. I mean, even just a small thing.
I wouldn't like to try and encourage people to. I certainly wouldn't encourage people to leave their religion and believe in all in all religions together and so on, or a new synthetic religion or anything like that. No. But I think that it's bound to happen.
This is where Lex says, well, that's a big point of disagreement. I feel it's important for people for whom it's their destiny to hold the independent traditions, again, quote unquote, in their purity. And Vilayat clarifies that he wouldn't advocate for anyone to leave their religion necessarily, but just that the falling away of religious forms is inevitable in his eyes. And I think it's a great question to contemplate in terms of Pir Vilayat's standpoint, is the long view of history. It's easy to look at traditions that are still existing, but how many traditions from 5,000 years ago are still existing? Not very many. They've mostly merged into new kinds of forms. And so I think Pir Vilayat is not saying something so much different than that. Saying it's inevitable, forms will merge and fall away. But Lex again feels almost like defensive, and I think you and I, Nathaniel, can understand where he's coming from, because there's this defensiveness of these traditions are beautiful, in the cultures in which they've grown and established, and even, traditions like Islam or Buddhism that have spread far and wide and have taken on the cultural forms of wherever they spread to. There's such immense beauty and richness of culture that it's very sad to think about a time where this tradition might not really exist in a living way in the way that we know it. And so that's a tender place, and of course, very sensitive place in terms of nobody wants to be told, oh yeah, your religion is just going to go away at some point. It's not that important. And Pir Vilayat sometimes sounds flippant in that way, but I do think to appreciate what Pir Vilayat is saying, we have to take the bird's eye view and really see the long form of history. And what he's saying sounds radical, but it doesn't seem to be that radical if we're really looking at history, honestly.
Yeah, I appreciate that you qualified it that way. I mean, one, for you and I, we're speaking of, one of our lineage masters, is Pir Vilayat. And so, even when there's some disagreement, it's with respect, because we do not even hold the tradition in as much as that we do without him passing it to us. And I think it would be easy to begin to disagree with him unless you understood that very, very long view. And from that very, very long view, yes, that's pretty much the truth of all religious traditions. Like, we don't have something that we had before, long ago. And it is also important to remember with Pir Vilayat as a kind of unique persona and as a particular character within the Inayati lineage of Sufism, he tends to take long views and high views, to get very, very high above a situation, then look down on it. And even his metaphors, emphasize these things when he teaches. And so if we're talking from where we're standing, like Lex Hickson, just walking out of Istanbul, he flew, of course, but he's just been there. He's just been in situ, as you say, in context. So his view is lateral, horizontal of a context. And so if you speak to him from the long view of history and he's looking at something horizontal right next to him, these two things seem in great contrast. And so I think that that's something that we have to understand when we listen to them disagree. On the other hand, I myself am often in this position as somebody that's thought to represent interspirituality. And when I'm in dialogue with people who are at least believing themselves to be representing one of the historical traditions, I sometimes get put in the role of, the enemy of those traditions. I'm certainly not. I'm professor trained in comparative religion. I love the historical traditions. I have a passion for them and knowing about them, and I participate in them. And even my Sufi initiatory name, Muinuddin, it means protector or shield of religion. And so it's funny to be cast in that role for me, because I'm a great champion of the value of our traditions. But when I'm speaking for interspirituality, it's often the fear that I'm meeting from somebody representing a historical tradition is that they might think that I'm representing a position that invalidates their tradition. That interspirituality and where it's going, and that because that may be an evolutionary impulse to learn what is between traditions and value that somehow is going to invalidate and ultimately phase out the historical traditions. But that is not my view at all. I do believe, along with Pir Vilayat, that things will continue to evolve and mix and change as they always have. But that doesn't necessarily mean the phasing out of our historical traditions, because our historical traditions have been evolving too. They will continue to evolve along this same trajectory of mixing and changing and adapting to different environments. So I take some issue with that in the shorter term, that they're just going to go away. No, they're evolving also. They don't exist in a, as Pir Vilayat would put it, a homeostatic purity.
Mm-hmm. I think one dynamic that's important to name in terms of the conversation is what we touched on in the beginning in terms of where Lex Hixon is coming into this conversation from, but we didn't exactly mention where Pir Vilayat is coming from. And correct me if I'm wrong, but Pir Vilayat is slightly older than Lex Hixon.
Yes, definitely.
So he's a more elder, and Pir Vilayat at this point is very much established in who he is and what role he's playing in the world and as a religious leader. And he says it, he's very clearly sees himself as a pioneer. He wants to go through the untrodden paths and maybe open space and open pathways for people where the well-trodden paths, as he says it, aren't accessible or aligned. And I think if we're reading through the lines, Pir Vilayat really isn't trying to do any kind of violence against traditional religious leaders, and even cites his own Sufi teachers in Hyderabad, who themselves are traditional Islamic Sufis and fully orthodox Muslims. I don't think he has any judgment of that for themselves, but what he's saying is, that's not for me. And Lex Hickson points to, he not only has this lineage that has been passed to him and trained in from his father, but he also is fully Western trained academically and was a scientist and very much into science and the cutting edge of quantum physics. And he sees himself as that pioneering kind of figure that is pushing things forward as he sees it. But again, we talked about this in our first episode. We tend to talk about old and new, but old doesn't mean old as in something to be discarded. It just means there's something new that is also to be included. And I think Pir Vilayat is just very strong in his perspective, and there's a lot that he almost takes for granted. He's like, this is where I'm at. And he projects that to say, not only this is where I'm at, but this is where the current cosmology of the world is. And he sees that his view, whether he's right or wrong, he sees his view as in alignment with our current evolving paradigm in terms of where we're at on the planet Earth and societally.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's part of it, is that Lex Hickson is very much in this grappling, questioning phase, and Pir Vilayat has seemingly already done this grappling for himself and has come to this place where, at the very least, he feels rooted in his perspective for himself and what he wants to represent. And time again, he does represent, maybe the more radical interspiritual end of the spectrum, which he's not particularly invested or interested in how particular traditions are going to evolve. For him, it really is the mystical truth that he sees as not bound to any one tradition, but as the ultimate medicine for the planet Earth and integral for the evolutionary process of humanity and the planet. And that his perspective is, I want to merge science and spirituality and have there be an accessible way to actually manifest our human potential. And I don't so much care what that outer form looks like. I care about people actualizing their human potential and the benefits for the planet of that.
Yeah, I think that that's right. And I think it's very important to name they're not in the same phase of their life, as you noted. So Pir Vilayat, born in 1916, and I think Lex Hickson born 1941, so there's some 25 years difference here. And contextually, again, Pir Vilayat actually went through a long period of, we might say, spiritual gestation. He did not emerge as a spiritual teacher as a young man. He has a long time he's digging through this material for himself and coming into a leadership that was left to him by his father and a transmission that was given to him, but it took him a long time to come into his own around it. And so I think this is correct, that Pir Vilayat was in his 50s before he really took on the mantle and really came into his own in the late 60s and 1970s. And so we're meeting him now after a long process. And, and as you note, he sees his mission and his own interest in a very clear way at this point. So he's not, the questioning young man that Lex Hickson is in his 30s here. And one is already an established Sufi master who's responsible for a community, and another is not yet come into that leadership role. And as my own teacher, Rabbi Zalman, liked to say, who was friends with Pir Vilayat, he said to me, Pir Vilayat was and wanted to be everything on the margins, which is to say he wanted to be on the growing edge of, the evolutionary edge of spirituality. Where is it going? And that's a person and a personality that feels the teleological pull of the future and orients to the now according to that pull of the future. And that's already a position. But Lex Hickson himself, he catches on to that at a certain point in the interview. He's a really solid thinker himself. And you probably remember the part at which he notes, maybe both of us are already located in a meta tradition or some place that is not in traditions either.
I think the part that you're referencing is where Lex Hickson challenges Pir Vilayat, essentially saying maybe you're a lot less broad than you think, because actually you're just viewing everything through the one lens of your tradition, which is the Universalist Sufi tradition of Hazrat Inayat Khan, your father. And Pir Vilayat doesn't exactly fight against that. He says, yeah, that's basically true. That's my worldview. That's my bias. We all have it. And so he's not denying that. I think the one point he states is, again, he says, well, it's not because it's my father, just I have this particular connection to this lineage. He really feels like the universalist perspective is an example of the emerging paradigm of the now. But that's a fascinating point, I think, to hone in on here, is a universalist worldview or orientation to religions is maybe just as narrow as a traditional religious worldview that is not universalist. It's just one worldview, and it has its blind spots and it has its orientation. It's just like in anything in life. Like, look at a stem cell. A stem cell is an incredible thing because it can particularize to become any cell that our body needs it to become. As a stem cell, it's not doing anybody any good. It has to particularize to become something. And once it has become a kidney cell, it can't be a liver cell. And so we all particularize into a particular thing. And to deny that, I think, is where we can get into some distortion. And so a lot of it is kind of owning our universalist or interspiritual worldview and even questioning that and seeing what are the limitations, what are things that maybe from our worldview we dismiss as valid in the same ways we might criticize a more traditional religious worldview that eschews, what we would maybe consider some basic scientific or psychological truths. And in that way it can be narrow, but we can be narrow in the same way. And so, yeah.
And this is why it's so valuable, like Pir Vilayat was certainly interviewed by other people. Ram Dass was certainly interviewed by other people. But this series of interviews on In the Spirit are particularly good because of the interviewer and the insight of the interviewer. You know, this Lex Hickson in this phase of his life is a person who's asking important, sincere questions, thoughtful questions. And so that's why these are so good, partially because of Lex Hixon and his selection of who's on the show, whether they were famous or not, but he knew where that inside band of great teachers were, and he was asking them great questions. And the great insight that he's bringing here is one that we don't factor enough. If you're going to talk about universalism, once you start talking about it, it's no longer universal. Any universalist perspective is just that, one universalist perspective. And so if it's the Sufi universalism of Hazrat Inayat Khan, it still has a character from Sufism. And so it cannot replace any other universalism or be overarching above them. It's a perspective. I think it's worth kind of hearing it in Lex Hickson's own words.
I want about backgrounds. One thing that I returned to when I came back to this country, after being very disoriented, is my original spiritual teaching that I so to speak grew up with. I was an agnostic, and as a child, my family were not members of any church. But when I was about in my early 20s, I met Swami Nikhilananda of the Ramakrishna order and spent 7 years with him studying the Vedanta and meditating on Ramakrishna, who was a kind of all-embracing, you might say, Sufi.
Yeah, really.
And I've returned to this, and I realized that, well, perhaps this is, for some strange reason, my background. I mean, and that perhaps I am really rooted in that particular tradition, and then I'm seeing all the other traditions somehow subtly in the light of that. And I wondered, in your case, perhaps you are really completely rooted in the teachings and of your father Hazrat Inayat Khan, and that really you are seeing everything else in the light of that in a subtle way. And in that sense, you could say you're not eclectic at all. You're completely focused in a certain way.
That is true. That's perfectly true. But I think the reason is not because he happened to be my father, but because that teaching is so much in tune with let's say, the thinking of the planet.
It's really great because it's true. It's also true that a universalism, if fixed, is particular. It's a particularism. And then, as you noted, Pir Vilayat goes on to say, that's perfectly true. I think that's what he literally says. He says, but not because it's my father, but because that view has proven itself to me to be true, that we are watching the evolution of our traditions, and it is not one tradition anymore, but the divinization of humanity that we're looking at. So when Hazrat Inayat Khan talks about, the message or the message of our time, in some ways that's code for a traditional Sufi teaching from Ibn Arabi about the Wadat al-Wujud, the unity of all being. So the message for Hazrat Inayat Khan is that it's the message of the unity of all being, that we are all united by the sacred substrate that is underneath all of our existence, and the existence of all being, all things are divine. And that's the kind of one view that unites us, or could unite us. And so he's saying, yes, it's not because he was my father, but it's because this is true in my experience. And that's the basis of my universalism.
And then just to name that Pir Vilayat's father, Hazrat Inayat Khan, is coming out of an Indian context in which he had deep exposure to Hinduism as well as being Muslim himself. And so that it's in this context of the religious diversity of India, in which looking at the world maybe through that lens of the unity of all being, that then the unity of religions or the compatibility of religions seemingly becomes obvious to Hazrat Inayat Khan. And in this interview, there's a great point where Lex Hickson notes this kind of resonance between Ramakrishna, who himself was this kind of early prototype of an interspiritual pioneer, an ecstatic figure and saint, but the unity of religions does come into his teachings, and how there's this resonance. And Pir Vilayat just notes that it's very interesting that both his father and Ramakrishna came to this place of recognizing a unity of all religions, both from an Indian context, one being Muslim and one being Hindu from birth. And I think when we're talking about universalism, that's one of the things that really excites me, is it seems that a universalist perspective, or the compatibility between different traditions, has been naturally arrived at by people who were existing in contexts that were diverse enough to actually give them exposure in a real way to a diversity of traditions. And I think India is a great example of that, but we can also look to China, in which there's an incredible exchange between Confucianism, Taoism, and Buddhism, and a lot of teachings exchanged. And at a certain point, I believe during the Ming Dynasty, there was even a fully syncretic religion that was created that was a 3-in-1 religion that was trying to take the best of these 3 traditions, which were the 3 most prominent traditions in China, and create a true syncretism. And then we can look also, coming out of an Indian context, we look at Baha'i. And, Nathaniel and I are American. We imagine a lot of our listeners are American. We live in an incredibly diverse place, a beautifully, beautifully diverse place, where we also have access in English translation to so many spiritual and religious texts, that a lot of what I see as emerging in terms of people recognizing the resonances and similarities, and at the very least that they're not diametrically opposed or in contradiction, and that even maybe there's a underlying truth that even pervades these, is a natural, at least to me, my bias, seems to be a natural impulse of encountering true diversity.
Yeah.
It's not a new thing at all. It's not a new thing. You look at Tibetan Buddhism. This is like an amazing meeting of a variety of traditions. Hindu Tantra and Bon, Indian Buddhism, Chinese Buddhism. They're all mixing to create what we would now might be very tight about, a very pure Tibetan Buddhism.
Right.
And so that's kind of what we're talking about. It's always been happening, and yet there's a very real question of how much a specific tradition will evolve and retain a recognizable essence, and how much traditions might merge and fall away in terms of name and form and become something that would not be recognizable to us in a few hundred years, for example. And I don't think we know that. I think that's a question,
Yeah, I think so too. And, it's a thing that I sometimes complain about in interspiritual circles, that among my colleagues that feel like, the day has arrived where interspirituality is the new tradition. And I'm like, if that's true, we seem to know nothing in comparison to a fully formed tradition of the past, where there's a whole culture and set of practices, not just a set of practice, a multitude of practices, and a clear trajectory through, a path to a certain kind of outcome of spiritual maturity or growth. If interspirituality is the new tradition, well, it's just being birthed. And so it seems to me like chutzpah, if not hubris, to speak as if it's complete and everything else can just fall away now.
Well, and in that vein, we're using the language of the old traditions often, and we're using practices, and we're using exemplars from other traditions. So it's almost, that's an interesting question, even though we've spent a fair amount of time kind of breaking down the concept of a pure tradition. What is interspirituality, quote unquote, in its purity as a kind of fully individuated tradition? What does that look like?
Right. So, the idea of the purity is, as we've already named, problematic because all of our traditions are syncretic, even though, that's the great bad word in religion, syncretism, but they're all syncretic. Any historian of religion can point out, the various strands of influence. And maybe there are ways of explaining that from within traditions which we don't have to invalidate. Still, nothing exists in a vacuum. There's influence everywhere. We're always responding to the environment and the other in the environment. So to go back a little bit, one of the great things they do in here is there's a little appreciation for India as a formative environment for universalism. And Hixon notes that both Hazrat Inayat Khan and Swami Vivekananda are both kind of missionaries coming out of India, kind of universalist missionaries coming out of India into the West. And they note two important things, both of them. I mean, Pir Vilayat and Lex Hickson now, that India is an interesting syncretic environment that loves to look at universalism, and it has an appreciation for it. And so it's probably not accidental that two significant teachers come out bringing some form of universalism, and they come out around the same time. So they're almost parallel figures, and they come into the West, and they both note that there's something about the coming to the West that is important. Like it's an environment in which you can plant this universalism, and they felt it was an important environment to come to. And some people have pointed out around Swami Vivekananda and Hazrat Inayat Khan, and my colleague Birzia has pointed this out, that it's kind of a reverse colonization. Upon the same bridge that was built to colonize India from the West, Indians came back across the same bridge with a kind of spiritual colonization of kind of universalism. And there's this kind of truth to that. Well, you built a road into India to establish your empire over them, but then what is not counted on is that something comes back across that bridge or road, which may in time change Western civilization. So it's a fascinating kind of idea in itself.
If you're enjoying the episode, please consider subscribing to our Patreon to help support the production of the podcast.
Subscriptions begin at $1. All patrons receive access to bonus content, curated resources, and exclusive patron events, including live Q&As.
For more information, please check out the Patreon link in the show notes, and thanks for listening.
As we start to come in for a landing, I think there's just one, though there's so many treasures in this dialogue between them, one thing we haven't quite unpacked yet, which is a very significant thing and difficult to discuss, is something they largely agree on, but what is meant by it needs some unpacking. And it's what it means to be, to identify with more than one tradition. And that gets talked about here in a way that, for me, needs some depth of discussion, and is sometimes talked about a little too loosely for my own comfort. And here it's the idea of saying, I'm a Buddhist, and I'm a Christian, and I'm a Jew, and I'm all of these things, which could be a lovely sentiment. Or in today's discourse, might be seen as colonizing itself, as co-opting a tradition to say that you represent it when perhaps you don't, in the way that the majority of the people who identify with it do. That's a difficult discussion, which is discussed here but walked over. Maybe, I don't know. How do you look at it?
I think Pir Vilayat states it pretty matter-of-factly. He's quoting his father with this saying, I am all these things. And I think Lex Hixon doesn't really challenge him on it, so they just don't really go there. But I know when we've discussed this idea and this pretty prevalent saying within Inayat Sufism, you've made the point that rather than affirming an identity, we believe that Hazrat Khan is pointing more to the fact of not saying, I am not this, or I don't believe this. And that's a big thing in Hazrat Khan's teaching, is as a default, accepting truths as true, and then trying them out in your own experience and verifying them. But to basically don't have a critical outlook. Don't assume something is not true and then verify it. Assume something is true, try it on and see. And so it's in that sentiment that I think he's really saying that. And again, it gets really tricky in terms of identity and what we're really claiming, right? I was raised Jewish, but I believe there's a way I cannot honestly say I am a Christian, in that I genuinely learn from and try to follow, at least in part, the example of Jesus Christ as a living exemplar. That's my own sense. Most of the time I would never say I'm a Christian, because I know that for 99% of intents and purposes, I am not a Christian. But I think that that's what he's pointing to. And again, it's a problem of language. He's trying to point to something beyond the words, an attitude towards life, one of deep appreciation for religious traditions and this assumption that because of the unity of all being, there's something to learn. And that it's not about taking on the identity.
That really is the crux of this. If we hear it given from Pir Vilayat, it goes like this.
You see, when I visited Professor Massignon, who was the great specialist in Sufism, al-Halal, before Professor Colburn, and a few days before his death, and he told me the story of his life. And he told me that he went to Iraq. At the time it was under the Turks. There was a revolution, and he was told that he was about to be captured and probably killed. And so he took off on a boat on the river Euphrates, and the boat sank. And they thought he was drowned. Well, anyway, he was drowned. And so they performed the rituals upon him before at death, and were going to bury him as a Muslim, because his last words were La ilaha illallah. They thought, well, he's a Muslim. And then he revived, and they told him, and he said, good God, but I'm a Christian. You mustn't bury me as a Muslim. And he said, well, you said La ilaha illallah. And then he told me, he said, when I look back upon it, I realize that in fact I'm both a Christian and a Muslim. Now this is something that appeals to me very much, because he didn't say I'm not a Christian or not a Muslim. He said I am a Christian and a Muslim, and that's exactly how I feel myself. And not only a Christian and a Muslim, but I'm also a Buddhist, and I'm also a Hindu, and I'm also a Jew, and I'm also a Zoroastrian. And it's not pure by eclecticism. I really believe in the great value of what they have to teach.
I can't say that I've ever met anyone who said so clearly my own feelings as you just did.
And then he goes on to say, do you think that there are people who do keep the independent traditions as Christians and Jews and Muslims, and you think that that's valuable, or do you think that's going to fall away? And then they get into some level of disagreement about that, which we've already discussed as, the kind of long-term view and the contextual view. But there is something important here, and you've already been mentioning it. In the collections of teachings of Hazrat Inayat Khan, there's a collection called the Ghathikas. And in the first Ghathika, on what is Sufism, he writes, to the questions, are you a Muslim, a Christian, or a Jew, etc., the Sufi's answer would be yes rather than no, for the Sufi opposes no religion, but sympathizes with all. And so, as you've already pointed out, Daniel, the emphasis there is on not denying, not necessarily in affirming an identity, but not in rejecting an identity. And that's a subtle point, but a really important point here. So I think for Hazrat Inayat Khan, he's living and speaking in a time of high surface tension and high division, and there's certainly a right thing to be in most environments, and it's whatever the environment says. So it's the right thing as a Christian in one environment. And so it's important not to deny these other traditions. As a professor who teaches Islam, I see that as a great responsibility today, because the tradition becomes rejected by many elements of American society. And so I think it's important to teach it well and accurately and to represent it. So more than affirming, it's not denying. We have to be careful with the affirming. When Massignon says it, what he's trying to represent is I assume, a deep personal rapprochement. He's come to something inside that it was like, I was raised, Christian, and I've come into this adoring relationship with this tradition of at least a Sufi Islam. And at this point, internally, I am this. And that's very hard for anybody that's respectful to take away from him, what he's affirming there, because he's affirming his personal experience, and by what right do we deny it to him? And when Pir Vilayat says he's these many, many traditions, the most we can affirm is that that may be his experience, that he is. But should Pir Vilayat then represent himself as a Buddhist in a Buddhist context and then speak for it? Now that becomes the question. And that's the mistake many people end up making when they think that they are all of these things.
But to be fair, Pir Vilayat didn't do that.
No.
Pir Vilayat spoke as a universalist Sufi. And again, it's kind of to this point of he's actually just holding one tradition, and this one tradition is a universalist tradition.
Right.
And it's interesting to note, with you reading that sample from the Ghathika from Pir Vilayat's father, there's a subtle shift.
Mm-hmm.
Hazrat Inayat Khan doesn't say, I am a Hindu, I am a Muslim, I am, etc., etc.
Yeah.
He says, if asked, are you X, Y, or Z, the Sufi would say yes rather than no. So it's just interesting to see that shift, and maybe speaks to the difference in terms of their own life experience between generations.
Mm-hmm.
And that it's maybe Pir Vilayat Khan who's really steeped in the universal tradition from a very, very early age, whereas Hazrat Inayat Khan more came of age in a more, all the language breaks down, I'm wanting to say a more traditional context or tradition. But again, I don't like that, because I think my own bias is to feel like the human heart and soul and body and mind, that is the traditional context, which all the spiritual searching and experience has always happened. And it feels weird to call one thing traditional, and I don't know. I'm losing words, and it's often, I am not a professor of religion, and so there's all the things I can feel in my heart and sense, and it's very, very tricky. And I think what you're speaking to is Hazrat Inayat Khan is more in a time where that was like the cutting edge, is like affirming our absolute unity and kind of pushing differences more to the side to emphasize the unity. And now we're at a place culturally where I think many people recognize the importance of affirming that unity, but we're also sensing how important it is to really empower and hold up different groups and traditions and different particulars in and of themselves, and allow them to be autonomous and in and of themselves. And there's almost a violence around unity and a kind of whitewashing that can happen that we see as problematic now. And so I feel like we're in a really interesting place with it, of trying to hold the sameness and the difference, the unity and the diversity. And ultimately, my own bias is to feel like that's actually just the nature of unity, that included within unity is radical diversity, and that it is the one and the many, and one is not more valid than the other. And so that we really need to hold to both ends of the spectrum and exist within that tension. And in terms of practical questions of how these traditions evolve, a lot of that is for specific traditions to discern. I went to this university in Europa. I just received an email from them informing me they're running a conference on the future of American Buddhism. Like, that sounds like a great conference to be discussing exactly this question. Like, what does this overarching Sangha feel like is necessary for Buddhism to evolve in this context, and what are some things that we need to address in terms of problematic things or whatever it is. So yeah, just wrapping up, I know we are a little bit all over the place in terms of this interview, but I hope you enjoyed. And I'm just curious for you, Nathaniel, if there's anything that feels like we haven't touched on that is particularly juicy or we want to bring out before we close.
I don't know. I really feel like we've touched on the essence of this interview, and the crux of it was one person's real searching exploration of what this is going to mean in their life. And the expression of their spirituality for the rest of their life is kind of at stake, and he's really pushing the questions, and it's really fantastic. And a lot of it has to do with identity, and I think those are important questions for us today about identity. And, unity and particularity. Sometimes in spirituality, we push the unity, and it is certainly important. Like, if we're going to survive, we must know our unity. But not as a whitewash over particularity, because that's the other aspect of today. We must know and respect individual experience. And so, it kind of brings some value back to unity and diversity, our own e pluribus unum. Even if there's an emphasis in spirituality to say, no, you have to know that this thing that you're thinking of as other is just another aspect of the same body. That's critical for us to know. It's not the only thing to know. That would just be another monoculture, We exist in a tension of expansion and contraction, unity and particularity, and going back and forth between valuing these two things. There's one moment, it's important to know the particularity. Another moment, it's important to value the unity. And we don't escape that tension, nor should we try.
Yeah, I love that. And I feel like a lot of it comes down to skillful means. The one lingering thought I have in terms of this last thing we were talking about of affirming I am X, Y, or Z is my own sense of that is almost in our current times, that feels very much in alignment for me to hold internally and out of alignment to express externally.
Yeah.
And that's maybe part of the tension, and that's just where I'm at or whatever. But there's something very powerful about allowing ourselves to engage in a real way that I think if we say, I am not this, it doesn't necessarily allow for that engagement. But again, we could talk ad infinitum for this, because there's also the question of what does that mean to engage? Like, I don't think anybody has a right to tell me who I can commune with in my heart, but maybe I don't go to the temple of a specific tradition because my very presence there would be an intrusion because I haven't been trained in particular customs. And so there's really a lot of space, and I think it's important for us in terms of where they were at in the 70s. I think this piece of diversity and sensitivity to difference and how to move within those spaces in a respectful way is the cutting edge of what's kind of up right now. But what I would hope is not lost in all of that is this idealism of the early kind of late 60s and early 70s of we're all one and it is all one, and there is this mystical truth that is available. That's very much my own bias, but I do think both ends are incredibly important and a fascinating discernment for us collectively, but also for each of us individually in terms of how that really manifests within our own hearts and minds and souls.
Yeah. I think another way to phrase what you just said, and it's very important, is if it's me personally, and so this is no big disclosure because this is well known about me, that I have strong connections to, say, Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. It may not be for anybody else to validly say, I am not any of those things. It's not for somebody to tell me, hey, you're not a Christian. Hey, you're not a Jew. Hey, you're not a Muslim. It's not for them to do that. But it is a question of discernment for me to check or qualify how I represent those things when there are large bodies of people that do identify more exclusively with those things. And so that's the tension we all have to hold. And so that's a very important discussion, and maybe a good way to end is, I also like, that we're appreciating the impulse that was coming from the 70s towards unity, and how much they're affirming, the mystical experience of the unity of all our traditions. And so we're certainly not trying to diminish that, because that's so important to us. We're still the outgrowth of what was happening then. And we're just trying to add layers to our understanding of it. But in the end of the interview, to end with a quote, as we often do, they come back to affirming Islam in a universalist way. And so at somewhere midway through the interview, Pir Vilayat affirms Islam by saying, that my father said,
when he was asked something like this, he said, there is not one drop of blood in my veins that is not Muslim.
Important to understand that from a few perspectives, but Islam means surrender, the surrender, meaning that whatever God wants, I'll do that, I'll be that. And so a Muslim is then one who has surrendered to God. And in the very end, thanking Pir Vilayat for the interview, which, as you noted, he and his wife left just on an ecstatic high from what they felt was a kind of transmission in dialogue. And Lex Hickson says,
There's not a drop of blood in you that's not Islam. Thank you. Thank you very much.
and again, affirming that identity. There's not a drop of blood in you that is not surrendered to the divine impulse. And that's what we're all ultimately serving.
That's beautiful. I still feel like I want to end with a poem.
So this is some words from Everyone, which is a re-envisioning of the medieval morality play, Every Man. And it's really a very beautiful expression of affirmation of life. Still I feel you, good rain upon my skin. Thank you, sweet eyes, for seeing, ears for the murmuring of water, for wind and storm, for the hymn of birds, the humming of the flies. I, a stone, I see the stones, alive. I hear the water seeping into the roots. I see the leaves still breathing. I hear the mosses grow. O timeless, nightless life of life. These ears, already deaf, still hear your awesome singing. Is this the touch of death? So are you real death? You are not real death. All is alive. All is life.
Shout out to friend of the show, Treefort of Golden Turtle Sound, for producing the intro and outro music and assisting with mixing and mastering. Be sure to check out his awesome music and hit up Golden Turtle Sound for any of your audio engineering needs.